So, ladies and gentlemen, over this morning's time, we looked at civil discourse and speaking truth to power from the perspective of higher education. So now we want to move on and address that third influential institution on our discourse, the media. And this afternoon we have some great speakers to discuss this, their role in helping educate us, inform us, speak truth to power, and hopefully add to a civil discourse. So as we turn our attention to the media, we often refer to them as the fourth estate. That term is often used to emphasize the role of the press as a watchdog over the three branches of government. They speak truth to power to the government. Our founding fathers, and you heard this from Judge Napolitano last night, believed in checking the tendency towards a tyrannical accumulation of power. And so that's the fourth estate's role. However, as we've set the context at the beginning of the conference, the 2016 presidential campaign, besides exposing those ideological divides, pretty well sunk some of our civil discourse into the mud. So, in that discourse, the media reported on the discourse in the country, but also added to some of the problems with the discourse in the country. Skewed press coverage, sometimes outright propaganda, and the proliferation of many opinion-based programs contributed to this political partisanship and uncivil discourse. So this panel is going to look at the notion of accountability or activism, the fourth estate in 2016 and beyond. We have a number of distinguished journalists who are going to talk to us about various aspects of the media, how they speak truth to power, freedom of press issues, and perhaps how to contribute to our understanding and our checks on those three branches of government. So, our first speaker today is Matt Gertz, who is a senior fellow at the progressive media watchdog Media Matters for America. Mr. Gertz's recent work has focused on how the mainstream and conservative press have covered the Trump administration, as well as the Trump administration's efforts to undermine the mainstream media while promoting newly empowered right-wing news outlets. Mr. Gertz has been cited by CNN, the BBC, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times, Politico, BuzzFeed, and the Daily Beast, among many others. Mr. Gertz, please join us on the stage. Welcome. Our second panelist is Professor Ali Cologne, the Knight Professor of Media Ethics in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications at Washington and Lee University, right next door. Prior to joining Washington and Lee, Mr. Cologne spent more than 30 years in journalism, and he worked for a news service, daily newspapers, public radio, network television, and Journalism Institute. Most recently, he served as Director of Standards and Practices at NBC News, and Telemundo Network News. Mr. Colon has conducted newsroom training for more than 50 news organizations and has done consulting on diversity, ethics, writing, editing, and leadership. Professor Colon, please join us. Our third panelist is Mr. Seth Mandel. Seth is the op-ed editor of the New York Post, where he is also a regular columnist. Previously, he was the assistant editor at Commentary, where he edited and wrote for the print edition and the publication blog. He continues to write for the magazine. Mr. Mandel served as a National Security Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and was an award-winning newspaper reporter and editor before that, during which time he served as a board member of the New Jersey chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. He was recently named a New York City and State Rising Star. Mr. Mandel, please join us on the stage. So while Seth is coming up, ladies and gentlemen, the format for this panel discussion is actually a conversation between the panelists, a conversation between us. I'll act as the moderator, and I'll begin with a couple of questions, and I'm going to be out in the audience. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll recognize you. And please come to the microphone to ask your question of the panel. So we want to have a great conversation. Seth, welcome. And I want to start it out so that we're all on the same sheet of music and understand what these three gentlemen have done and are doing. And so I want to ask you, gentlemen, and I'll start with Professor Colon. Could you tell me how we should define what a journalist is, and how do we prepare a journalist to operate in this very ambiguous information environment that we're in? And then I'll ask the rest of you to just kind of chime in with your thoughts.
Well, I believe that, first of all, the term journalist can be a fairly fluid word to use, because traditionally we think of journalists as working for a news organization and adhering to that news organization's orientations toward coverage, whether it be of the world, national, local, state, and of the environment that they're in. But there are journalists also who work for magazines, they work for TV and radio, not in the capacity necessarily of just reporting, but they can also be in a position of analyzing, of explaining, and offering opinion as well, because that's part and parcel of what a journalist can do. What I think is most important for a journalist to do is that I tell, and I believe, and I tell my students is that journalists have been given a great gift and have a great responsibility. That gift is they get to chronicle the journey of all of our people. The responsibility is to do it in a way that all of our people can understand the multitude of stories, where we're going and where we've been, in a way that they can make sense and make judgments about how they understand the world around them and how they want to act in them.
Seth, you want to chime in?
Sure. What is a journalist is not such a clear question anymore, as you said. So I think the best way to understand it is what someone does rather than what their position is or their daily job or something like that. I think that journalists have to adhere to certain ethical standards and lanes and report. If they follow those and report in that way, then I don't think it matters whether they're writing for their own blog at home or whether they're working for a major newspaper. I think that the key is to for everybody to try to have a common consensus conception of what it is you're doing and the rules and regulations to follow. And I'll give you an example. There's a journalist who I'm friendly with who was recently profiled by BuzzFeed, Yashar Ali. He writes for New York Magazine and sometimes the Daily Beast. And the story was interesting because Yashar is a political activist. He's in his 40s, and he spent most of his time as a political activist and then a political staffer in California. And he was a fundraiser and a bundler, I think, for Hillary Clinton's campaign. So he spent his time in insider political circles. And then he went into journalism. And it's sort of a late career conversion for him. But if you watch what he does, he is... so the story in BuzzFeed was about how you make a transition from being somebody who is trying to get candidates elected and who is responsible for spinning a politician's policies and their actions to the press and controlling how that information comes out, and then making that transition to a reporter, not necessarily just a journalist, not somebody with a Sunday morning TV show where the flow of reporting and opinion is a bit more unclear, but somebody whose job it is to report straight. And he is fantastic at his job, and one of the things that he does is he chases down stories relentlessly, and he doesn't publish anything that is that he doesn't have sources for, that he doesn't have the story. One thing I've noticed for him is the one thing that always caught my eye about Yashar, and this is I think an important thing to keep in mind, is that you can tell a journalist by what happens when they get beaten to a story. Journalists who get beaten to a story that they knew existed, that they understood was happening, but they got beaten to publishing it, those are probably the best journalists around. Because what it means is they couldn't substantiate things enough to put their name on it, and they take the fact that you're talking about public officials, people with a public profile, and families and careers, and they take that seriously. That, to me, is the mark of a journalist. So telling that story is, today it's very fluid where people are coming from and who they're writing for, but I think if you follow certain guidelines, then you will be seen as a journalist, no matter where you come from or where your background is.
Matt, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Journalism is really a set of principles and ideas and practices that people who say they are journalists all try to follow as best they can, as much as they can. Unlike these other gentlemen, I do not consider myself a journalist. I'm an activist. I'm a researcher and someone who spends a lot of time analyzing the media, and a lot of what I do is journalism. It is the collection of facts, the assessment of them, and the publication of them. But I work for an organization that has a specific mission and specific stated goals that we are open about. And I think that is sort of what distinguishes a journalist from another type of communications professional. It is whether or not you are beholden to another organization that is not, strictly speaking, a media outlet. And that, I think, is Yashar Ali is an interesting case study there, since he operates independently now of those sorts of political relationships and is thus now a journalist.
Great. So as I listen to each of you, you've talked about a journalist adhering to certain practices or what we might call a code of ethics. And so as we look at the environment that, especially over the last 2 years in this news cycle, seems like it's hard to figure out what those practices are that we should consider ethical. So could you address the question of, as a journalist or as an activist writing journalistic articles, can you kind of throw out a couple of key practices that we as consumers should look at when because it helps us choose which publications or which sources we want. Which you think are the most or the best ethical practices in journalism? How do we know?
Well, I'll volunteer Bob Steele, who is a master ethicist in journalism and had a long career in helping set up both codes and principles, are the ones that I'm most familiar with, although I also teach ethics at WNL and look at other possibilities and other codes. But he had three fairly simple guiding principles, and that was to seek the truth and report it as fully as possible, act independently, and minimize harm. Now, there are other codes, Society of Professional Journalists, which has added accountability. There are other ethicists who have added transparency. But I like the cleanness and the brevity of this one, although there are subset points. What it does is that you'll find that each is a principle, but each of those principles are in tension with each other. In other words, how do you seek the truth but minimize harm? How do you act independently but still deal with the truth you have to get? And that begins a process by which a journalist is not static. It's not like looking at instructional codes that say this is the way you are. And many institutions have that, and they can be very helpful. But they have to be sort of a thinking person's principles. How do we move through our particular profession in a way to bring stories that people will find credible? I tell my students, and I ask them sometimes, what's a CV? And some of them are familiar, some are not. Some will understand it's sort of like a resume, an academic one. But I say, this is your CV. The C is for credibility. The V is for verification. If you don't have those two, you're not a good journalist, you're not an ethical person, and you're not doing your job.
Great. Would either of you like to add on?
I would just, that's pretty much it. I think the credibility part is a really important thing, and that's what a lot of news agencies are struggling with in the age of social media. I think that one of the things that we see about Twitter, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter, more than I should probably, and in fact, recently I had a lot of work to do. I was writing a column and editing the section and putting the section together. I had so much work to do. I said, I'm not just going to go off. I'm going to close the tab that I have Twitter on open, so I'm not even going to see notifications and stuff like that. I'm actually going to close Twitter, not even look at it for the next few hours. And I couldn't believe how much work I got done. So, but I think that these sorts of things in social media pose a certain challenge, because you see reporters and other journalists on social media expressing opinions, and you start to wonder how those opinions shape their reporting. And everybody, the first thing to understand is that everybody has opinions. You can't, there's no reporters who, it's not like when they get the job, they flash that Men in Black thing that makes you forget everything that happened before that. You have opinions, you have values, you have things you uphold, and people come from all sorts of different directions. So the common set of principles is a really important thing, but I think that the credibility is something that everybody's kind of struggling with now to figure out, in a world where you think something and then put that thought out into the world, a lot of times without really thinking twice, how to maintain that credibility, and that to me is the biggest challenge, I think, right now.
So let me dwell on the credibility thing right now. So if I want to believe any polling, the media is pretty much below 20%. I think the last poll I looked at, taken about a year ago, had about a 19% kind of a favorability rate for the media, believing it as credibility. So credibility is key. So part of credibility goes into sources and the reliability, maybe a past track record. Could you talk a little bit about, when you're writing stories as a journalist, how important is it to use different types of sources? What role does anonymous sources play? And do you think in the current cycle, the use of so many anonymous sources, at least it seems lately, further undermines this credibility factor?
Well, I'd say here's the issue that at core. A lot of times you'll see people say, journalists are not objective. And that is true. They are not. As Seth has indicated, we all have opinions. And objectivity was really never meant to be an actualization. It was always an aspiration. It's like the Ten Commandments. If there's anybody in this room that hasn't violated the Ten Commandments in some way, then you're not thinking. It's always been an aspirational effort to be as good as you can be. And as using that as a guide, you can try to be impartial. You can try to be fair. You can try to make sure that you are more complete in the way you do things. And in doing so, what you can do as a journalist is to remind yourself, frankly, that you do have opinions, that you do have biases. And by the way, biases people think is a bad thing. There are people who have a bias to coming to VMI. Is that bad? There are people who have a bias to being in the military. Is that bad? If there's a bias for things, it means that you have a leaning towards something. It doesn't mean that it's dirty or wrong or a problem, but somehow we've made that word into be something really bad. But if you have a bias about stealing, you're going to get in trouble. If you can just bias about lying all the time, you got a problem. So you need to recognize what your biases are. You need to understand what the more complex landscape is of the world that you are trying to write about or broadcast about or talk about or podcast about or tweet about. You can go all the way through all the various platforms. You need to be aware that you have biases, and how do you find a way to mitigate, minimize the bias, and maximize as much of the factual, truthful, what you want to say is straightforward information that will help people see what you have, which is the news is like a mosaic. There are different pieces to it and in different ways, but it tries to give you a picture of the way the world is being seen by that journalist, by that news organization, and it's a two-way street. You can't sit there and just swallow. You have to come back and challenge the news media. Ask them why they're doing things. Offer them information. Let them know if they're doing it right or wrong. Make sure that you are a part of the process, because journalism is not anything without the people who are engaged in it and the people who are receiving it. And together they make a fuller, more complicated, but more complete picture.
So let's talk a little bit about sources, and we were having a conversation before. So often these days it seems like there will be a story that says 4 anonymous sources say X. When is it appropriate to use an anonymous source, and why would you want that anyway? They'd probably flunk any class I gave if they said footnote, anonymous source. I'd say, where's your evidence? So when is it appropriate? And Matt, you want to try and...
So an anonymous source, it's a compact between the news outlet and the reader. The news outlet and the reporter is saying, this is information that we think is very important for you to have. And there is no other way we could get this information to you. Because of that, they need to be used fairly judiciously. And with a certain sense of wisdom and with a certain sense of understanding that the paper is putting its credibility on the line in offering that compact. Generally speaking, there are often various requirements that you need to have at your newspaper in order to be able to publish an anonymous source, and the same for radio and television and so on and so forth. Often that policy largely amounts to send the decision upstairs to the editor-in-chief, and he'll make the final call on whether this is important enough and whether this is something we simply can't get any other way. The difficulty around anonymous sources, of course, is you don't know who actually said it. Sometimes there are some pieces of information that you'll be given. It's information that comes from a U.S. official. It's information that comes from a Democratic member of Congress, so on and so forth. But you can't say who exactly is the person who's doing it, and because of that, it raises the question, why is this person trying to get this information out there? Is there some benefit that accrues to them by getting this particular piece of information out into the public? Do they think that they can change a presidential decision that's currently underway? Do they think that they can benefit their own future career trajectories in some way? It becomes more difficult and more challenging without that sense of like, this is the person who said the thing. And of course, at a time when trust in the media is lower, fewer people are willing to accept that compact without question.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I think that's basically right. I mean, I think that, I think first of all, it's true that the numbers are very low in terms of trust in the media, but if you look at the timeline, it's actually very interesting. If you look at the timeline, the numbers were really high until right around the day that Matt started at Media Matters. And then there was this, I think that, I think that trust in media is a problem, but in large part there's also a partisan element to it, which is that people just have stopped. I mean, one thing is in general there's a crisis of authority in American culture and American politics right now. I mean, you're seeing it. It's not just politics. You see it, not to make any sorts of comparisons, but when you see some of the news out of, say, the entertainment industry these last couple of weeks and stuff, people, the places you look to for some sort of not necessarily, they're not your life coaches, but when you look to for some sort of leading lights of whatever that sector of American politics or culture is, you find reasons for mistrust. So I think that there's a partisan element to it, and people, there's a really high what they call negative partisanship these days, which is, I don't really care about this issue, but I want him to be unhappy. I want him to lose more than I want, something like that. That's negative partisanship, and those numbers are really high today. So I think that's part of it. On anonymous sources, this is a staple feature of journalism. So how you feel about this stuff in large part comes down to your own sort of preconceived notions of the trustworthiness of the publication that you're reading. But there's definitely a balance. And the two things that are most important with anonymous sources are balance and, I would say, motive, which is harder to know. What is the purpose of the anonymous quote, the anonymity? What are they saying, and who might benefit and who might be hurt by it? You have to kind of do a little bit of Kremlinology in your head. I mean, there's a way to consume news to avoid some of these pitfalls, but you, as a reader, you have to be an engaged reader to try to figure this stuff out. I was with family friends recently, and this couple were asking me a lot of questions about journalism and politics and this stuff. And one thing they said was, we read the story, and it said that everybody was blaming Jared Kushner, and then we read the story in a major outlet, and it had this anonymous source talking about how it really wasn't Jared's fault. It was a kind of a witch hunt. People were trying to blame him, whatever, and had all this stuff. And they said to me, like, how does that story come about? How do we know who those sources are? And I said, well, that one's easy because the source is Jared Kushner. So sometimes you have the figures themselves are, they will appear in print as someone close to X, and they're really person X. So you have to be careful about stuff like that as a journalist. You can't have an article full of anonymous sources who are all the people that are being spoken about, but the quotes are from those people, and you're writing that they're not from those people, right? So you have to be careful about the provenance of the quotes. You can be clearer about who the anonymous person might be without naming them. And you get into more trouble when you say straight out, when you straight out mislead your readers on who that person might be, especially because you might be being spun by them. So I think that's one of the pitfalls, I would say, motive, and it's hard to read. And then there's balance, is just you can't have every source in an article be anonymous. You have to have a trail of breadcrumbs for people to follow. There has to be some verifiable stuff in there, and there has to be a more complete picture painted, especially if it's an important and investigative story.
There's another thing I'd just like to add that we haven't touched upon, which we all face as consumer of news, and that's an issue of confirmation bias. And when we decide, and I think increasingly the public is doing this, that I'm going to believe this, but not that, then we've got a problem. If you really go back in history, to the 40s when there were multiple newspapers in a town, no matter how many, there were lots of them, even small towns, you used to pick up the paper that fit your worldview. And you knew the other 5 newspapers were lying. But you bought them anyway to find out what those lying newspapers were doing. And so then you would sort of get a balance, but you still kind of believe your newspaper would be Republican, Democrat, Independent, Socialist, Communist, all those papers were out. As consolidation took place and we became more of an entity that was run by major organizations, those organizations couldn't do that. So they had to strip out a lot of that bias and leave you with sort of vanilla type news. And people thought, well, okay, that seems like that would be working. But then people weren't always hearing the kind of news that they wanted to hear. And as we progressed through that century and other outlets became possible for them to hear the kind of news that they wanted, they would give their tone or their orientation of veracity to that one. And all of us have to be very careful that we should read and we should watch and we should pay attention to a variety of journalistic organizations, news organizations, so that we can understand where other people are coming from and what they're thinking. But we have become divided, and in that division, I think a lot of that drop in really credibility has taken place because you're really mad at all the other people.
Yeah, great. So on sources, there was a story that broke last week about this infamous dossier on the president, and that it started out from the Washington Beacon looking for paying for opposition research. Is that an appropriate way of gathering information from any of your perspective that's then going to be printed out?
It depends. It depends on the case. I mean, it certainly can be. The thing is, there's a lot of oppo research integrated into reporting. That's a big part of things, and a lot of outfits will do the digging up and feed tips and stuff to journalists. So I don't know of a case personally in the past where it was the outlet itself was paying for the research outfit who then went out and did it. So that is new to me, and I'm not really sure. I don't really have a frame of reference on that because that's just a brand new thing to me. And I can see both sides of the argument. But oppo research is political journalism is littered with that information coming from those places, and this seemed to, I guess, kind of cut out the middleman. But there's a lot of political journalism that is, the reporters get tips, they get information from all sorts of different sources, and there are people who keep track of this stuff, and there's a lot of gray area there. And I'm not, the hardest thing about journalism and journalistic ethics is where there's gray area. There's not a set principles. You talked about the 10 Commandments. Some things are commandments, and a lot of it's not, and you have to use your judgment. And as a society, we want to use collective judgment, but things are so divided these days that I'm not sure we're really capable of getting to that point anymore, and so that affects it as well.
Matt, you live in a little bit different realm on this particular subject because your organization is pretty out front what you're about. So as an activist and for Media Matters, what's your view, or maybe you do have money that's spent gathering opposition research. How do you use material that's gathered from maybe that type of research in your work?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it largely comes down to, is the information true or not? We do a lot of research at Media Matters that uses techniques that are traditionally opposition research techniques, and those techniques are not terribly different from journalistic techniques all the way around. You're talking about gathering information and analyzing it and figuring out what you can say and what you can't say. If you try to put out information that is either unverifiable or obviously easily debunkable, you're going to run into a problem pretty quickly. The Free Beacon is sort of an interesting case you don't, it is, as Seth says, something that's unusual. I know that they did something similar back in 2014, doing research, paying an opposition research firm to do research on Hillary Clinton. There were some issues there because the opposition researchers were identifying themselves as reporters, which is an entirely different set of ethical problems. This is probably where I should disclose that the executive editor of the Washington Free Beacon contributes a column to my wife's blog at the Washington Post, because Washington has all sorts of strange intertwinements. But at the end of the day, it's an unusual way to gather information. It's certainly not one that is traditionally used in the media. I'm not necessarily sure that that means that the information would be somehow invalid. More of the questions around that are going to involve how was the Washington Free Beacon discussing the dossier and discussing Fusion GPS, while that was a story that was, and their own role was unknown.
I would like to add that I don't believe that journalists should, if they want to be ethical, be engaged in oppositional research. They should be engaged in research, period. And that means whatever is bad, whatever is good, whatever is in the middle, that's what's taking place. When you talk about, at least stereotypically, oppositional research, is they're trying to get stuff, usually dirt, on someone else that they see or perceive to be the opposition. But that's not something that journalists should be engaged in a unilateral way at all, but should be engaged in trying to get information that helps make that story more complete.
Great. So you brought up some great points, and we're talking blogs and things are online. So since the 1990s, the media landscape has changed significantly with the advent of 24/7 news shows and, of course, online and social media. So I'd like to go to Professor Colon first, because you've been in just about every sort of broadcast medium. How has social media changed the landscape and the conversation now?
I think it's something tremendous in a way that it has created almost an upheaval in the way that we find, disseminate, and deal with information. I think it has some benefits because we are hearing many people, their voices in ways that we might not have heard them before. But I also think it's a bit of a kind of like Pandora's box of unleashed technology, that everything is coming out, and it becomes, I think, challenging to know, what's accurate, what's not. And I was reading in the Wall Street Journal, actually, a column a year or so ago, and the author was reviewing a book, and he says, he was talking about technology, and then he basically reaches in, and in his column, and he reaches in and he pulls out talks about his phone. He says, right here, he says, we have all the information of the world in our fingertips, in our palm. And he says, do you know what most people do with it? They share pictures of cats and argue with people they don't know. And so I questioned not the technology, but how we use it, what we do with it. And that can be any technology. We, as citizens, I believe, have a necessity to be thinking thoughtfully and thinking thoroughly and questioning what's going on and looking for information. Technology is less important than the people who are using it. The trouble or the challenge with the technology, it is so easy for me to go to my phone and bring up a blog from somebody who is, maybe on the planet Mars, and then another one's on the planet Venus, and wonder, should I be in this solar system at all? Is there another place that we can time travel to? Because it's not as clear as it was before. And that, I think, is very difficult for everyone. And while it's a wonderful engagement, it's like being in a playpen where there's a lot of kids playing with a lot of toys, and nobody wants to give theirs up.
Seth, any ideas? How has that changed how you do business at the New York Post?
Yeah, it's actual stories get broken on social media, especially Twitter, which is a very different situation now. That is a that is a milestone on the media timeline of history. That stories are being broken on Twitter. I mean, the one that always comes to mind is our friend Keith Urban's. He broke the news that Osama bin Laden had been killed. That President Obama scheduled an announcement at the White House at an odd time, at an odd day, and people were all on Twitter speculating, which is what most people use Twitter for. And he went on and he worked in the Bush White House, and so he has connections to people in the defense industry and whatever. And he came out and he said, I'm hearing from credible people it's Osama bin Laden, that they got bin Laden. And I don't think that had happened before. I mean,
The
this
second confirmation on that was The Rock, if I recall correctly.
It is that was new. So it's also turned into a news feed, which muddies the water even more. When we talk about how journalists use Twitter, and when I was talking before about how much work I got done when I closed Twitter, when I went dark on Twitter for a few hours, I mean, I think I was 2 hours from curing the common cold. Like, I'm just a newspaper editor, but I think that there was a major medical breakthrough in my veins on the way, and you start to wonder, the sky's the limit. But it's hard to get off Twitter completely and not use it at all, because although it has a lot of negative effects on our culture and on media and on politics. I mean, it is a place where people are angry, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not against people having anonymous accounts. There's a lot of people on Twitter that I like very much that are anonymous, and they have good reasons for it. But the anonymity of millions of users means in this last election, maybe you were talking to a person, maybe you were talking to a teenager in Macedonia who was posing as an official in the Defense Department. Maybe you were talking to a robot, a Russian bot or something. It makes things harder to know who you're even talking to, and that is something that journalists really have to struggle with. I know people behind some anonymous accounts who have named accounts, and I see them arguing with people from both sides, and the people they're arguing with don't know that this anonymous person is also this person, and I wonder, like, there are ethical issues at play in how you use that anonymity. You can say there are reasons for my career, I have to be anonymous, but there should be limits to what I think you do with it. But I think that has really muddied the waters, who is even a person with a name, and who are they, and where is it coming from, and how do you corroborate something like that?
So isn't that very anonymity breeding part of the distrust between what's out there and what you can trust, whether it's in journalistic circles, the publications, but also on social media, blogs, etc.? Because it seems to me that anonymity breeds lack of accountability. So why would we want to have this anonymity? That's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, I think that's right. It breeds distrust, but you can't. There are limits to what you can be and what you can do with anonymity. Somebody in my job, you can't have the op-ed editor of the New York Post be anonymous, right? There have to be limits to what you let people do, and we're also really strict about pen names and things like that in the paper. I mean, I think that anonymity has to really be very limited, and it's the same thing with anonymous sources. I mean, it has to be limited, and it has to be a place where you can trust. When I first started as a reporter, I was a local news reporter in Jersey, and you work your way up with the types of stories that they'll give you. You earn your trust. So, like, the first week on the job, I covered a 4th grade spelling bee. And at some point that year, I was talking to a member, the communications director for a member of Congress on a bill, and he said, well, here's what's going on, but you can't use my name. It has to be anonymous. And I said, no, that's no good. And I hung up. And my boss, my editor, was like, what'd you do that for? And I had never used an anonymous source before that. fourth grade spelling bee participants use their names. They stand behind their names.
They're spelling.
They can spell, and they spell their names for you. That's right. This is important
Anonymous
as a
is a good
reporter.
word for it.
That's right. So you definitely there's a certain healthy distrust that's bred into you before you go into that world of anonymity, and I think you have to take some of that with you into that world and set limits on what you're willing to trust from an anonymous source and what you're not.
I think that's, by the way, I think that's really important. Seth made a good point about trying to understand what you're doing. And I believe you are always at risk as a journalist using an anonymous source. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it if it becomes necessary, but when a reader or a listener or a viewer comes across a blah, 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 blah anonymous source, you pause, who the heck is that? How do you spell his first name or her first name? Is it Mr. Anonymous or Mrs. Anonymous? It's become a culture, I think, in politics that is sometimes becomes necessary because people don't want to lose their jobs, but sometimes too much because people just don't want anybody to know that they're talking. And I've dealt with people who wanted to be anonymous sources. And what I always did was say, well, tell me why. And then you'd find out they were a little nervous about this. And I'd say, well, this is very public information that you could share. And by the end of it, I usually got them on the record on what was going on. But their first inclination is, I don't want anybody to get mad at me for doing this. But there are legitimate reasons where people need to be protected because they have jobs, they have livelihoods, and the only way for them to share this is through you. But if you do that, you must verify the information they give you. You should never, ever, in my view, take it unilaterally without verifying it on other fronts and making sure that that person who's giving the information is able to give you stuff that you're putting your name now. You're the front person now for this anonymous source. You need to be able to do it in a way that you can be convinced that this is as legitimate as you can establish it, because you'll lose your credibility when everything blows up later.
Matt, any thoughts?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about Twitter, which I think is appropriate. Journalists are obsessed with Twitter because all of the journalists are on Twitter and the President of the United States is there, so we have to talk about it. But I think an issue that we haven't gotten to yet is Facebook, which has become sort of crucial to the news business in a couple of key ways. Most news outlets made a determination a while back that they were going to put their news product out on the internet for free. They weren't going to pursue a subscription-based method of trying to monetize that work. They were instead going to put it out for free and rely on advertising. And that has not worked out terribly well. Advertising rates online have plummeted. And a big and important factor here is Facebook is what drives all the traffic. It is where people tend to be getting their news these days. Just seeing a piece come across their news feed, clicking on it, and then reading it. And this has a couple of problems. One, it incentivizes journalists to produce headlines that walk up to the line of dishonesty in order to get readers to click on the piece, which obviously has some real ramifications for whether journalists tend to be believed. Two, there is the issue of it's very difficult to tell on Facebook if an article that you are looking at in your newsfeed is from a legitimate source, or if it's from, as Seth mentioned, 16-year-old Macedonians who have discovered that they can make a good amount of money from writing up fake pieces of news and getting them shared on Facebook. So that causes some major problems. We talk about Twitter. Twitter's important, but Facebook is where all the money is. And I think in the years to come, we're going to see, because it is such a major content distributor, it's going to run into some real questions about whether it's operating as a media outlet or not.
Yeah, so you bring up a great point, Matt, which is about business models. And news agencies, by and large, media outlets, are a business, so they have to make money. So headlines, as you mentioned, sometimes the so-called clickbait to get you to click on a story are important because it'll generate revenue ultimately. But does that help us? Does that help breed the so-called fake news that we have? So I'm interested in you all's view on what the heck is fake news. Sounds like propaganda to me. Please comment on that, and then I'm opening up the floor to you all's questions after that.
So the original definition of fake news, when it started coming into the conversation in the fall of 2016, was deliberately fabricated information that was put out in a method that made it look like it was coming from a legitimate news source. That definition got skewed quite a bit, in large part because the president started referring to news articles that he did not approve of as fake news, and describing the media universe in general as fake news. But that was sort of the original definition, and it got carried away from there.
Yeah, these terms are hard because it doesn't really matter what we think fake news is, right? At this point, I mean, Matt made the point well. I think the president has, he's very good at branding. You know, this is what he does. I remember when he gave a speech on North Korea a while back, and he was at the UN in this, at this official forum, and everybody was very formal, and he said, Rocket Man over in North Korea is going to be sorry or something like that. And everybody on Twitter was like, oh man, can you believe it? It's so juvenile. And I said, like, juvenile or not, we're going to all start calling him Rocket Man now. Like, we don't want to, but we're going to. This president is so good at, Lion Ted, everybody knew who Lion Ted was, Crooked Hillary. I mean, this stuff, it sounds juvenile, but it's simple and it sticks. So he's very good at this, and he has the bully pulpit and the audience. And so I think that fake news started as a thing, as an industry. It was an industry to make money. People were selling fake news, but it was fabricated, and it was from fabricated sources. It was, people would pretend that this was a newspaper, but the newspaper didn't actually exist. It was fake from start to finish. That is very different from what we see called fake news now, but I think that we've basically lost that battle anyway, because it's just used as a sort of pejorative now, and I think it's one of those things where in this fragmented system in society, everybody has their own definition of things, and also I think that there's a real partisan element to it, which is that you had fake news, actual fake news, and then you had things that were wrong about the president, and his supporters were defensive about the fact that they had been hit with the idea that he was elected based on this thing called fake news. And so they were like, hey, wait a second, it takes two to tango. The rules have to be the same for everybody. This story is not true, therefore it is fake. So I'm not really sure that fake news means anything specifically anymore.
I agree. I think that, the whole idea of fake news, I think used today is more an oppositional stance, saying if I don't like it, it's fake. If I don't believe it, it's fake. If I'm not in agreement, it's fake. All said, by the way, by people who don't even research it and try to find out, and they should be trying to do that. But this is kind of old news. I mean, the first reported kind of fake news was when the serpent told Eve, "You shall not die," and went downhill from there. I mean, two generals, Octavian and Mark Antony, when they wanted to succeed Caesar, Octavian spread basically fake news around Mark Antony. He lost it, and Octavian became the new Caesar. This stuff has been going on for a while.
And the snake in the Garden of Eden was anonymous.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's there. What's unfortunate today is that the way that it is being used, it impugns all news. And I think that is going to come back to haunt the people who are so intent on highlighting what they think is fake news. In some cases, it is fake news, but they're doing it with a lack of research and I think of being able to check it out and figure out what's going on, that, it's going to be like, they came for those people and they finally came for me and there was nobody to speak for me. And we're going to be in that position if we, as a population, as a people, not as journalists, not just as citizens, but together, begin to search and seek and want to find out the truth instead of slapping labels on it.
Great. I'd like to open up the floor to questions from you all. If you have a question, please come forward to the microphone and address the panel at large or a specific member.
Hello, Quinn Conrad from VMI. My question is, as we've discussed the movement and the changes that have happened to media and to news reporting as an effect of social media, is this something that's only happened within the United States, or do you see this being a phenomenon on the international level as well?
Which aspect of social media?
So the idea that, as you all referenced, like the news breaking over social media, or how social media reporting has kind of affected the maybe validity or the way that news has been reported, is that something that only specifically happens because of the systems that we have in the U.S., or is this something that can also be happening or occurring on the international scale in different countries?
We're late to it. I think it happened elsewhere first, because you have authoritarian societies where social media used to be known as alternative media, and these were ways around the official sources of news. And we were, as journalists, we were curating quotes and contacts from Egyptians in Tahrir Square, where all throughout the Arab world in the Arab Spring, while all this was going on, and they all came from countries. Because it was the Arab Spring, where they were bringing down not just authoritarian governments, but they were bringing down the entire systems, right? I mean, the infrastructure of information was crumbling. Everything, the people, the gatekeepers, and the officials. So I think in terms of actual breaking news, I think we were late to it, and I think it happened in societies where this was the way that people could get truth out, and they weren't, this is the other thing that we're talking about, in a lot of cases they weren't what we would normally consider journalists, but they were breaking news. Mm-hmm. They were saying, we're on the ground here, and you're not. They wouldn't let CNN in. They let, Al Jazeera had access, but because you were seeing it through the lens, a sort of Qatari lens, you weren't always exactly sure, although they had an excellent live stream during the revolution, stuff that you could watch yourself and decide for yourself what was going on. But yeah, basically it was alternative media, and we just got around to it because we have such a free media, and the UK has such a history of a free and feisty media that we didn't need to lean on alternative media in order to break news. We got around to it when it became convenient.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Cadet Wilburn with VMI. This question is for the entire panel. We've talked about the evolution of media because of the confirmation bias. We've talked about how there's these sets of ethical principles that journalism should follow, and we've talked about how that's kind of gotten skewed on both sides of the political spectrum for some of these media outlets. But I'd like to know, and this is again for the entire panel, it's kind of an opinion question. Who do you think the burden of responsibility lies with to take the first steps towards pushing for more objective media? Do you think that responsibility lies with the media outlets themselves to provide objective media? Or do you think that responsibility lies more with the American people to selectively read objective media and provide an environment where objective media can kind of thrive rather than being stamped out by polarizing, opinion-based articles?
That's a tough one. It's a great question. A lot of the problems around this are rooted in the fact that the incentive structures for everyone are pretty terrible. Readers like to read what they like to read, and that tends to be things that they already agree with. News outlets want to create information that will be widely read for the benefit of the news outlet, for the benefit of themselves and their own careers. And there's a real problem with taking the first step, because when all of your colleagues or your friends or whoever doesn't at the same time, you're probably not going to do very well. I mean, I think a big part of it is education. A big part of it is teaching people about media literacy, about the different types of media. That's something that's been very effective in other countries. I think media literacy is not a topic that's terribly well taught here in the United States. I think this panel and this conference is a great step in that regard, though.
I would say that it's important to keep in mind that when I try to teach about the word journalism and I write it on a board, I ask students basically to find the words in the word journalism. And they'll find different words like jour, which is what we get soup du jour, and we actually get journalism du jour in a way. And sometimes they'll circle the letter I. I think I becomes too much of a use in our journalism. What I like to focus on is the our, okay? O-U-R. This is our journalism. And it's not, again, as I've said earlier, that journalism isn't over here and the public over here. We're connected. It's almost like an umbilical cord in a way. We are connected, and each has to work with the other and pay attention. If nobody pays attention to us as journalists, we're not doing anything. If we're not reaching out to the public, then we're not doing enough, and they need also to reach out for us. This is something that is part of our democracy. It's part of what founded this country, as unique as it is, was to have a free press and a free speech, among other things as well. But that was unique at that time. And I think it is all our responsibility to be able to hold on to and to advocate for.
Thank you.
Cadet Thomas, VMI. Okay, this works. So in the past couple of years, especially with Twitter, we've had sort of this idea of crowdsourced journalism, especially in regards to foreign affairs such as the Arab Spring and the Syrian civil war. And sort of there was this sense that journalism would move further away from established institutions to sort of maybe a more, I don't know, democratic basis. But now that we have this problem where you go on Twitter and maybe half of the things you see in your news feed are fake or skewed or to the point where they're just not true, do you think there's a need for a return to stronger journalistic institutions? Such as like traditional news sources like, say, the New York Times, or just stronger media outlets?
I think that, yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, in terms of, I'm not sure return to, because they certainly do exist, but yeah, one of the points I was trying to make when I talked about anonymous sources, and it's a good question because you make an important, when you bring up Twitter, you make an important point, which is that even people who have names on Twitter are actually not often anonymous, right? They're not their names, and even in case, and people take advantage of the situation. A lot of times you will have a technological breakthrough in this, and then people will jump in and have some fun with it, you know. And then in the first early hours of the Arab Spring, you were getting information you couldn't get anywhere else. And it was incredible. And you know, fast forward 5 years, and that incredibly erudite, multilingual 11-year-old girl in eastern Syria probably wasn't an 11-year-old girl in eastern Syria, right? That happened. People pretended to be. So this stuff goes on. Institutions are important, and I think one of the things you're seeing in the last few years are institutions are incredibly important, and we have examples. I mean, one of them is, you know, I'm right of center. I'm on the conservative side of things, and so we often talk about ourselves as outsiders. And there's been a right-wing populism that, you know, has obviously surged. I don't have to tell you. And so, but I think that for a lot of us on the conservative side of things, the events of the last 18 months or so are a really important lesson in institutions and the value of institutions. And you know, one of the things that I compare it to is when I look at, you know, and I don't want to get into, you know, a personal aspect of this, but you know, the unsealed indictments that were released yesterday, a couple of people that were around the president are people that have no business being around the president, right? I mean, it's, George Papadopoulos, the profile you saw in the media was probably not somebody who should be, close to the ear. And what one of the lessons of that was that there was no apparatus, institutional apparatus around the president, because he was the ultimate outsider, and there was no curating institution for that sort of thing. And I think that showed you the importance of it in politics. I often make the comparison, if you've ever watched the show Yes Minister, which is a British show, and I said, when you watched the show years ago, the first time around, you were rooting for the politician because he was always being stymied by the bureaucracy that controlled everything behind the scenes, no matter what he really wanted to do or what he was elected to do. And I've said this a few times, that in the last couple of years, I've actually started to watch it again through the eyes of the civil servants who are stymieing the people who are really, the villains, so to speak, in the show. But now you've grown to appreciate their efforts at keeping things a certain way. And then the other thing I'll say is that's in politics. In journalism specifically, yeah. And let me tell you, as somebody from the right, there have been a couple big stories and important trends in the last couple of years that left-leaning media have been out fronting, that I think have been of not just great value, because there's great journalism everywhere, but I think that should really impact the way conservatives look at the world. And one of those is there's been a lot more news about police interaction with minorities. Now, I'm from New York, so it's not news to me. This is all very complex, and the truth is always, often somewhere in the middle. But the story they were telling was not being told on the right side of things. But it's true. There really are problems. There are problems of systemic bias in institutions, and they must be told. And if you were conservative before those that news came out, before it really started being everywhere, you may have just instinctively been pro-police, and that's as a conservative, that's a great place to be. I mean, my family came with me on the trip, and my 4-year-old daughter has been going up. And you can imagine, because of where we are, this has been happening a lot, but she goes up to anybody in a uniform and says, "Thank you for your service." So now here, you'll probably be stopped by her, and she'll say, "Thank you for your," so it's good, the respecting the badge and all that stuff. Conservatives, the instinct there is good, but I think that there was news coming out that was not being heard on the conservative side of things, that was really important. And that's just one example, and that, you can't live in a bubble. And conservatives were, for a long time, we were the ones saying, not me necessarily, because I'm a coastal elitist, what do they call it? The Acela corridor. I'm an Acela corridor coastal elitist because I'm from New York. But the conservatives, the accusation of the bubble was coming from conservatives, and I think the left media has punctured some very important bubbles on the right. And so, yeah, I think that there should be institutional trust, not just in the media, but I think that conservatives should learn to have respect for institutional mainstream media, like, as you say, the New York Times and other places, and the other way around too. That left, people on both sides of the aisle absolutely should develop a keen sense of earned trust. Don't believe everything you hear, and be an engaged reader. But yes, it's really important, especially when you're inclined not to trust something on that side, to find an institution that has been doing something pretty well for a really long time, and learn to appreciate the institutional knowledge that is contained therein, and the role that plays in producing the truth.
Thank you very much.
My name is Njeri Jenkins, a political science major, leadership studies minor from Hampton University. And my question is, do you think political correctness plays a role in polarization? And if so, do you think that political journalists and politicians need to take more caution in their political correctness, or is it just a case of the American society becoming overly sensitive?
How are we defining political correctness?
Example being how people say that President Donald Trump should and should not say certain things about how he said that the Mexicans were rapists and things of that nature. How they said he wasn't politically correct.
I mean, so to that extent, I would say that, I don't think that's a politically incorrect thing to say. I think that it's a fairly offensive and probably crossing the line into racist thing to say. I think we've run into trouble in the media around how we talk about comments like that because we have differing interpretations of what those comments mean and what the heat behind them is and how they are felt. And I think that sort of disparity does lead to that increased lack of unity. But I think there are also things that you shouldn't say because they're offensive and they cross the line. And that's one of them.
I do think that there's a tendency among people who were accustomed and comfortable saying things about other people that were critical or stereotypes, feeling hemmed in by now I can't say this because it's politically incorrect, right? But I also think it's kind of not a very valid excuse because this is in the media as well, by the way. I mean, I just showed a video in my ethics class before I came here where they were misrepresenting Asians in all kinds of ways that fed in completely to the stereotypes that some people have about Asians. And so I think that what's important is get the political out, okay, and get the correctness out, and let's get the totality in, which is how do we refer to people in a way that is respectful? You know, I mean, you may not like them and you may not care about them a certain way, but part of the civil discourse that's been underpinning this entire conference is how do we talk to people in a way that we can recognize them as people? If you go back during the time of the 60s and 70s, I have to say, those of us old enough to remember that, the military was not held in high regard. And you know, when I was involved myself, you know, I got called a lot of names that I didn't appreciate and weren't true. But people find this as a shorthand to get to people and criticize them, instead of recognize that everybody's different and recognize them as human beings that ought to be accorded the respect that we would want to be accorded ourselves. And you'll generally find that people who get mad that they have to be politically correct have no problem trying to stop somebody branding them in a particular way that they don't feel comfortable about either. And so I think it's a lazy person's way of trying to get themselves out of saying something really stupid.
Thank you.
Good day, Hamid Elias from Randolph Macon Academy. My question is how plagiarism is a really big deal in the whole society, in schools, in colleges like these, and different institutes. But like, how is it such a big deal in journalism? How are the consequences people found plagiarizing? What different, what do they use in journalism for this cause?
Look, you just fire them. You get them out. I mean, in part, here's the challenge. Let me tell you a little story about a president of a college that I learned about historically. And it was found to have plagiarized a speech. And the board of trustees took him into his office and said, you know, this is not acceptable. You know, we cannot have you do this. So this is, and then he says, okay, he says, see my books are there, just pick out a book. So the guy picked out a book, and he says, open the book. He says, okay, open it to a page, open a page. Start reading the first paragraph, start reading further. The guy finished the rest of the page, verbatim. And he said, what you need to know is that when I read a book, it becomes mine. It's in my head, all right? So he thinks, and by the way, he kept his job, he thinks that he wasn't plagiarizing because he had absorbed it. I don't think that that's actually right, because what plagiarism is about in general is stealing. That's what it's involved. Sometimes people forget, and they do make human mistakes. You accumulate all your notes, you're going to different sources, you're going to different websites, you put them into sort of a blank page, and then you yank out a portion of it, drop it into your paper, and you forget to attribute it. I wrote a column on this that says, great journalists give credit. And that is, every time you see something, if you can't be sure it's yours, give it credit. I mean, someone else wrote it. It's not bad that you found it and you're sharing it, but give credit. But plagiarism is considered sort of like, in journalism, kind of the original sin there, because you're stealing somebody's intellectual work. And that happens in journalism too, where they do fire people. In fact, they fired a columnist who plagiarized himself, which is pretty bad, right? I mean, he wrote a column that was the same column he'd written before, and someone else noted it, and so the newspaper fired him. And he said, wait a minute, how can I plagiarize myself? He says, because you were representing to your readers that this was a new product, and it was an old product, and that's not right. That's pretty extreme in some ways, but it goes to the center of what you're talking about. And that is, you shouldn't steal somebody else's work. Just like if somebody took your work, put it in their paper, and took the credit on that. And for journalists, it is a very, very serious offense. And usually when you find out it's happened, many of these people, they're fired.
But not always.
But not
I mean,
always.
someone like Fareed Zakaria
He
is
should have been
apparently
fired, right.
he should have been fired, but he wasn't.
He
was too big to fail, which
Well, it's not too big
is
to fail. He bring in
brought in too much money. Sure. So Fareed Zakaria, in dozens of
Yes, you're right.
instances on CNN
Right.
and in the Washington Post and in Time Magazine and several other places, plagiarized material. This was made very public. It was a big scandal, and he did fine. And I think when media outlets fail to take corrective action, that is something that does a lot of damage to credibility. Brian Williams, fired from NBC as anchor of nightly news because he was fabricating stories about what he had seen when he had been a journalist in Iraq.
Right.
He took a time out for a while, and then now has a show on MSNBC.
Right.
Media outlets need to take corrective action. They need to be willing to make these people who breach ethics to that level examples. I think often they do, but sometimes they don't, and I think that does a lot of damage to the institution.
Yeah, I agree, and I would just add that plagiarism gives me nightmares. Like, it keeps me awake at night, the fear that I will accidentally plagiarize, if that makes any sense. The internet, everything is everywhere. Sometimes it's hard to believe that there's something new under the sun. And when I sometimes now, I work at the New York Post, so if you haven't noticed, headlines are important to us. But when I think of a headline that I think is clever or something like that, I Google it. I really do. I put it into search engines and I see it. Did somebody else, think of that first? Stuff like that. That kind of thing keeps me awake at night because there are so many words out there. And I would say that, we've gotten pretty good at determining what is real plagiarism. Like, sometimes there's a sentence that just is the way you say something, and things like that, and distinguishing. But yeah, I mean that should be a fireable offense, and it should keep people up at night. And it does on the other side. A friend of mine is the journalist who discovered the or I don't know if this is who you were talking about, but somebody who was part of his problem was self-plagiarism. Also, he had just been fabricating other things, and he was a very high-profile, up-and-coming, successful journalist with a multi-book deal. And my friend was the one who noticed that he was, and this story is all out there, so the details are, don't need to be hidden, but my friend also happens to be an absolute Bob Dylan obsessive. I mean, obsessive. And he noticed that in one of this guy's books or articles, there was a quote that it didn't ring true to him. And this was a person who said, like, I think I know every interview Bob Dylan has ever given. Like, I'm not proud of it, but I think that I'm an expert in this particular area. And he asked the journalist for a reference, and he followed up on that reference. He looked into whatever. Anyway, he was sick with guilt and stress before his first article outing this person as a plagiarist and fabricator went to press. He was physically ill. I think he was existing on a diet of cigarettes and coffee. I think it was like the breakup diet. It was like he was wasting, and he's a husband and a father. You know, he had a family and all this stuff, and he thought of things in that way. You know, I'm going to take this guy down, and this guy's done, because plagiarism is one of those things that in our industry really most of the time ruins you, and and probably should. And he knew that if I came out with this article, you could come out with an article about a certain scandal about a politician, and there's a way to come back for it. And when you're revealing plagiarism, things like that, I mean, he was thinking to himself, I am ruining this guy's life, even if it's right, even if he deserved it, right? And he was absolutely sick over it. So.
Okay, we got 2 more questions to go. We're going to go into the lightning round. We'll get these
Thank you.
questions in, but I'll ask my speakers to be brief, be brilliant.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
I promised the brief part of that.
Cadet Bayman from VMI. I was, earlier you mentioned about how we have the world, all the information in the world at our fingertips pretty much, and how we don't use it like we should sometimes. But with all this information, sometimes it's hard to filter through it and to find out what's right. In science, we have a reproducibility crisis in a lot of experiments, and in the media, you can read 2 different articles about the same thing and get completely different views. How should we, as consumers of the media, how should we filter through that to try to get the truth in the end?
I mean, my recommendation would be read and watch and listen to as much as you possibly can from as many perspectives as you can. Read especially the pieces that criticize pieces written by the other outlets. That is very helpful to sort of adjudicate some of the discussions that are out there. It's really hard. There's a lot out there. Some of it's deceptive, some of it's not, and sorting through it is a challenge, and one that takes a lot of wherewithal to figure out.
Thank you.
In today's rush to get information out, especially after a big event like a terrorist attack, seems like people are just publishing updates as soon as they get it. Every article has a correction. After the Manchester bombings, I noticed there was a lot of talk about how the media kind of had a delay while the security forces and law enforcement were searching for the perpetrators. Has there been any discussion in American media about trying to work with security forces and not just put as many details out as you can every second and try to get a fuller picture of it?
Oh yeah, I mean that is a key part of the process. National security reporting gets vetted for that stuff, and not for content. Not like we want to write this article about you, and so the administration will say, well that'll make us look negative, so don't print it. But for classified stuff, you listen to the New York Times editors who wrestled with some of the anti-terror programs that they revealed during the Bush administrations and the consequences that they had to weigh on both sides. And those articles and what they were reporting absolutely went through the proper channels, in large part because, unlike WikiLeaks got caught releasing stuff with some unredacted stuff and names of people, that is without question an ever-present part of reporting that people should be careful about it. Don't give people a veto that you're writing about, but yes.
Yeah, I've got a speaker actually at the end of this week, Friday night, who's going to be speaking on reflecting before reacting, and why ethics matters. And he's an ethicist who says, we need time to think things through. In journalism and for journalists, there is this thing that we want to get it out right away, as soon as we can. But it's always valuable to hold back. We ought to really have a bridle in our basically journalistic mouth, pulling us back and saying, hold on, let's make sure you know where you're riding to before you take off.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen.